Started. Welcome to the 2021 Regent Cup competition. This is the final round, and we are honored to have our 4 finalists competing after a long day of debate. The final round is going to be an Oxford-style debate. I'm going to review the 3 different phases of the Oxford-style debate, and then I'm going to have the privilege to introduce our esteemed panel of judges. So first, to review the phases of the Oxford-style debate. In the first phase, there will be an opening statement. The opening statement will be presented from one student of the affirmative team and one student from the negative team. The second phase of the Oxford-style debate involves a cross-examination. During the cross-examination, the students have an opportunity to answer questions from the moderator and from one another. And I invite the judging panel to include any questions that you may wish that I ask the students in the judges' chat. The third phase of the Oxford-style debate has a little change last minute. So to ensure that all of our judges are able to judge you and score you, the final closing will be an hour long for each student. I'm just kidding. It's only 5 minutes each. I know you guys have been going since 9 o'clock this morning. I just really took a moment of panic. And to remember that brevity is an art and it is quite a skill. So to our judging panel, who will remain unbiased and of course objective, they have been trained in how to score the Oxford-style debate, and they will reflect upon which team gave the better argument. Now I have the privilege of introducing that panel of judges to you. First, we have Susan Bancic, the CEO of DMB Associates. We also have Mike Charney, the Senior Vice President of Emerging Issues, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation. I also have Anne Mariucci, former regent of the Arizona Board of Regents. And I have Michael Polyakov, the president of the American Council of Trustees and Alumni, and Robert Shibley, executive director, Foundation for Individual Rights and Education. Now, students, I will be timing, and as I mentioned, I will not time any prefatory comments that you have, but once your substantive comments begin, I will begin the timer. I will give you in your opening and closing a 1-minute reminder to let you know that your time is coming to a close. And when I indicate stop, you must stop your comments. So let's get started. The prompt that you will be discussing today is cancel culture is not a legitimate threat to free speech. Let's start with the affirmative side.
Right, so before we begin, Abigail and I would like to express our deepest gratitude first to our coaches for the long hours on Zoom and even longer hours over Slack messaging, to our debaters for fostering a team of care and commitment, which they've demonstrated so well in their amazing performance at today's event, to our storytellers for inspiring us with their experiences and a plethora of kind emojis of support, and finally to our Board of Regents, moderators, judges, and opponents. We would not be here without you. Now, to start, Abigail and I affirm the resolve. Cancel culture is a legitimate threat to free speech. First, an observation. According to the Cambridge Dictionary, cancel culture is defined as behaving in a society or group to completely reject someone because they have said or done something that offends you, a modern form of ostracism. See, the greatest issue with cancel culture is that it is defined by its outcome. There is a difference between boycotting something and seeing that it is canceled. If I choose to boycott a person or idea, that does not mean that it no longer exists, simply that I do not support it. However, if I choose to cancel someone, I will not stop until they have been silenced. Cancel culture is effective as a tool of censorship because it is not just my choice. It is an entire culture of people acting upon mob mentality to burn disagreement to the ground. We can all agree that there are certain comments online that are inflammatory, but this debate calls us to reflect on whether ostracism and the limitation of free speech are an appropriate response, and we believe that they are not. Our first contention is that ostracism erases freedom of speech and self-expression. The History Channel explains that while ostracism was a mean of punishing criminals in ancient Greece, it was phased out due to its massive and often irreversible psychological harms. Ostracism was a serious punishment like exile, and now it's being handed out like samples at a Costco. In his article for Mission.org titled "The Fear of Ostracism Keeps People Stuck in Mediocrity," Anthony Moore explains that people fear ostracism more than death. This fear means that when the threat of being ostracized for voicing an opinion or idea is present, people are more likely to suppress or even change their original belief. Because cancel culture is a looming threat of being ostracized, it forces many people to censor their own freedom of speech. This self-censorship is just as legitimate as government censorship and far more damaging. John Grusz, the director of legal studies at the John Locke Foundation, explains in July of 2020 that the fear of being canceled is actively limiting innovation, as researchers and scientists are afraid to publish work that have new ideas as they might get canceled. The most prominent example is a genetic researcher and physicist who was fired from Michigan State University after Twitter mobs decided his work was racist and eugenicist. Grusz identifies cancel culture as the greatest threat to not only private speech expression, but the free exchange of ideas. Our second contention is cultural erasure. Because cancel culture operates on a black and white morality system that doesn't account for the gray areas different contexts provide, it directly threatens free speech. Instead of having conversations that engage with why things are harmful and how we can avoid making the same mistakes going forward, we simply silence them into oblivion. This has two implications. First, in rewriting history, cancel culture doesn't just alter the present, it alters the past, which is incredibly damaging. The National Review explains on March 31st of 2021 that in the context of films or literature, cancel culture translates to acting like these types of media do not exist at all. Instead of interacting with them as historical pieces that we're aware of the shortcomings of, we simply act as if they never happened. Historians worry that as cancel culture calls for the removal of films that depict things like slavery from public archives, it will prevent people from understanding the reality of slavery. This erasure of historical violence makes us more likely to repeat it. Second, cancel culture erases other cultures. Because cancel culture does not ask for the context and relies on an individual's pre-existing understanding of something to define whether it is good or bad, it can eliminate the use of foreign cultures or languages that we do not initially recognize. BBC News explains how a professor was canceled following his use of a word that sounds like the N-word, only it was not in English. The professor, who was teaching students in a Chinese language course how to say that in Chinese, never got to explain himself. Though the situation could have been easily resolved so that all parties felt understood through civil discourse, cancel culture left both the Black students and the Chinese professor feeling bitter and culturally erased. We conclude with the remarks that cancel culture is, by its nature, a form of mob mentality, and having civil discourse in that scheme is tantamount to impossible. Understand that in the mental space of mob mentality, nuance and understanding are extremely difficult to express, making a free exchange of ideas at best ineffective and at worst a fatal mistake that could lead the person advocating for more nuanced ideas to get canceled as well. If everyone operated under this flawed mentality, the very thing we are here to celebrate today would not even be possible. So it is with this grave understanding of the turbulences of cancel culture and its propensity to hinder freedom of expression and freedom of speech, Abigail and I vehemently affirm.
Thank you. And for the negative?
Yeah, so before I begin, again, I just want to echo Langston's words. I want to thank all the people on our team who are out there supporting us in the chat. I want to thank our coach, Ted, for devoting so much time, so much energy to help us. I want to 100% thank my roommate and partner, Akash, for sticking with it this whole day. This has been amazing, and never did we really think that we'd be able to get to the final round. But with that being said, we're in it to win it, so I'll begin. Akash and I are extremely proud to oppose the resolution. Cancel culture is a legitimate threat to free speech. We hold that cancel culture may be a new phrase, a new buzzword, but in reality, cancel culture has been with our society from hundreds of years. Merriam-Webster defines cancel culture as the practice or tendency of engaging in mass canceling as a way of expressing disapproval and exerting social pressure. Essentially, cancel culture is simply a means of expression of disapproval by many people, often on social media. We reject the framing of the negative, which says that cancel culture is tantamount to ostracism and that it always produces the same outcomes. We're going to be showing you why for a couple of reasons. But first, we want to get into this discussion of a legitimate threat because we think it's extremely important. Free speech is defined by the Webster's Dictionary as the right to express information, ideas, and opinions free of government restrictions based on content and subject only to reasonable limitations. Since cancel culture does not prompt or act like government restriction of speech, we argue that it is not a legitimate threat to free speech. We can agree that specific instances of cancel culture are problematic, that specific people shouldn't be canceled, and they are not justified for massive amounts of people to express their disapproval of them. But this does not mean that cancel culture is a threat to the fundamental conduct of free speech. First, I'm going to be showing how cancel culture is just another form of speech. And second, I'll be going over some actual threats to free speech so we can contextualize the issue and explain why cancel culture doesn't nearly qualify as a legitimate threat. So our first contention is that cancel culture is just another form of speech, right? It's a person making a post online expressing their disapproval. So when you approach this issue theoretically, it becomes quite clear. When you decide to make a post canceling someone, you're expressing your disassociation, disapproval with a particular group of person. This is very clearly covered under the First Amendment as freedom of association. Even when used en masse by plenty of people, we still think that the same rules and same theoretical implications still apply. It's still just speech. It's still just saying, I don't like this person. Other people shouldn't like this person. In no way is that a threat to freedom of speech. The affirmation makes it seem, or they want to say that cancel culture is different from boycotts in some way, but it's really not. Cancel culture is just an evolved form of different boycotting procedures. Think of the civil rights movement. In 1955, African Americans in Montgomery boycotted and spoke out against the busing system to protest racist rules in hopes of bringing about change. Does that sound familiar? An institution was decidedly canceled by a mass group in order to express disapproval with the status quo and exert social pressure to change it. With the introduction of the internet, we've seen a shift away from the normalized term boycott, replacing the physical element with an electronic element, providing increased accessibility for others to join the now labeled cancel culture. We are not saying that specific bouts of cancellation are justified and that we should adopt cancel culture as the means by which we evaluate political opinions online or in real life. But what we are saying is that cancel culture occupies the same societal role as a protest or a boycott. Ultimately, it's just a mass expression of disapproval, a large-scale use of freedom of association. Cancel culture, furthermore, is not feckless, not devoid of impacts. We recognize that. But we would claim that cancel culture, on the whole, doesn't actually produce a huge amount of harm for people who are canceled to the extent of the negative claims. If cancel culture really did function completely like ostracization, you would not see the number of people who are currently canceled in the status quo continue to be huge successes, right? Think of Ben Shapiro, a conservative commentator who's been canceled numerous times. I mean, he's frankly associated with cancel culture. He continues to be a New York Times bestselling author and has in fact increased his radio show audience in part due to the attention brought to him by cancel culture. Similarly, think of author J.K. Rowling, who's been canceled, in fact, is a huge target for cancel culture. She's like, her name is literally like one of the biggest hits when you Google cancel culture. She remains a millionaire. She continues to make millions of dollars off of her books. She's in no way ostracized from society. I think the equivalency that the affirmation is drawing is really problematic, right? They claim that that cancel culture acts the same way as ostracization. Ostracization was an official tactic that societies use, governments, armies, like armed people forced other people to leave specific societies. Cancel culture in no way does that. In many instances, we've seen how it might increase somebody's attention or increase somebody's success. And so to say that that form of speech is a legitimate threat to free speech, we think is absurd. Which brings us to our second contention, which is that the First Amendment is quite robust, and it's been challenged numerous times with more dire threats than cancel culture, proving that if these are legitimate threats, then cancel culture ultimately isn't. So I'm just going to go through some Supreme Court cases which have dealt with actual legitimate threats to free speech. So the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society versus Stratton, which dealt with city laws requiring permits for political advocates going door to door. They held that was unconstitutional because the mandate would have a chilling effect on political communication. Brandenburg v. Ohio held that the First and 14th Amendment protected speech advocating violence at a KKK rally because the speech didn't call for imminent lawless action. Cohen v. California, which said that a California statute prohibiting the display of offensive messages violated freedom of expression. Or RAV versus St. Paul, a criminal ordinance or a case in which a criminal ordinance prohibiting the displays of symbols that caused anger, alarm, resentment in others were unconstitutional. So what we can see here is that the Supreme Court has shown time and time again that the legitimate threats to free speech are very clearly defined. There are two commonalities, I think, between some of the cases that I just listed. One, in all the cases where speech is threatened, governments are actively involved. There are actors, which, like the whole point of the Constitution is to restrict free speech from the government. Nowhere in cancel culture is the government the one actually silencing. Secondly, in all of these cases, there was not more speech that was used to censor people, right? None of these cases in which free speech was legitimately threatened was other speech used to silence somebody. No, it was enforced silence. It was legally enforced silence, legally enforced regulation, which limited specific kinds of speech. So we think it's logically impossible for simply another form of speech, cancel culture, again, whether we agree with it or not, to constitute a legitimate threat to free speech. For these reasons, we are extremely proud to oppose this resolution. We hope you join us as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Langston, did you cancel your partner, Abigail? That was unnecessary. Were you making a point?
Yeah, I was. I was actually canceling the other team. Yeah, I'm so sorry about that. It was a great speech, and I heard, I think, almost all of it, but I'm back.
Excellent. Well, let's turn to the affirmative team right now and take something that the negative team was saying. Is there really ostracism when cancel culture actually gives a megaphone, in some instances, to the person who was quote unquote canceled?
Yeah, sure. So first off, I think that cancel culture is a lot more pervasive than the negative side seems to think it is, because they talk about people like Ben Shapiro, people who are famous, who have been canceled, and these people are generally people who have these resources to bounce back. When we talk about cancel culture as a culture, we're talking about how it permeates in society, and this doesn't just happen to people at the very top. This happens to people that are, frankly, on our level. And to just say that cancel culture doesn't really affect anything that these famous people can say or do is, I think rejects the core idea of cancel culture. This also brings in the idea that they talk about the busing in the civil rights movement, that boycott. That is a very good example of when a boycott acted sort of like cancel culture. But when we're talking about cancel culture, we're talking about an entire population of people who vehemently will kick you out if you disagree with even the slightest thing that they talk about. I know I'm part of some Twitter circles. I have a friend who's had a friend who sadly committed suicide because she felt that she was kicked out of her community and she was just rejected, ostracized by everybody that she had known for 4 or 5 years. This is not just something that happens on the very top, but I think what we're talking about here is something that is more fundamental to our society.
Well, I want to, if I could just jump in here, I completely, sympathize with your friend, and I think that's awful what happened to her. But there's a difference between harassment, which is legally defined, there's legally defined protection against it, and cancel culture, which we both agree is generally like is generally mass disapproval, which does not tread into unprotected speech. So I think it'd be like, compare it to an actual like real world case, because cancel culture, what we're arguing is simply an online expression of disapproval, which could otherwise manifest in public ways. Think of a protest over a specific figure or a specific person. You would not say a protest who is like a group of people protesting using their First Amendment rights is a legitimate threat to another person's free speech, even if the protest isn't for justified, like even if we all agree that the protest might be wrong. To say that the protest is a legitimate threat to free speech, you see the issue there, right? It's contradictory in and of itself.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. I'm just on a roll today with the Yatley extravaganza. But I just wanted to hop in and articulate that, as Langston mentioned, there are a lot of the more everyday examples that we don't talk about, right? We love to talk about people like Ben Shapiro, J.K. Rowling, Nikita Dragon, Shane Dawson. There are people on the internet who have made a career for themselves of getting their name in cancel hashtags and coming back and coming back. But the stories we don't hear are the people who don't recover, right? As Langston talks about, there are small scale examples of canceling. For example, there was a student who said the N-word 4 years ago, and that video was sent to her college that she'd posted on Instagram that she was really hoping to attend. That video was sent to her dream school. Then the person who sent that video posted on social media, "Everyone, please contact this school and tell them that you do not want them to accept this student." What was the result of that? A tireless community of Twitter activists worked to ensure that this individual did not get into her school. The school had to put out a statement saying that they did not want the applicant accepted because she was too controversial. She was canceled. She was removed from her social circles. She was removed from the university she had already been admitted to. And all of this happened because of something she said 4 years ago. Because the nature of cancel culture is that you are over. It is not, let's have discourse about why the word you used was violent. It is, you said something and you will never come back. You are canceled. That's why frequently the hashtag that is used for canceling people is insert name is over party. Because we do not stop until that person is over. And sure, people like Ben Shapiro, J.K. Rowling cannot be taken down. But Langston's friend, this person who got into her dream school on a track scholarship, these are real world examples of people who have been taken down. And examples of people who do recover are not a justification to invalidate those who don't.
If I can respond to that. So if the resolution was cancel culture is problematic, I would sympathize with you. I would totally agree with you that maybe that person should not have harassed by the Twitter mob, and maybe they didn't deserve what they faced, so on and so forth. But we have to stick to the resolution. We have to stick to today's debate, which is if cancel culture is a legitimate threat to free speech. And pointing out individual cases, a few examples of people who have had problems with cancel culture. And then again, we contend in the opening, as Josh said, that there can be cases of cancel culture which are wrong, but that doesn't mean that cancel culture is a legitimate threat to free speech. Legitimate threat to free speech. An example I can give would be Newspeak from 1984. That's a legitimate threat to free speech, where you have Big Brother deciding what you should be able to say and read and listen. That's legitimate threat to free speech. Do you understand how the word the point I'm making, how the word legitimate changes lots of things in the debate?
Yeah, and I think this ties back into a conversation that I'm sure all of us had earlier, right? The quarterfinals round of this tournament, we discussed whether we felt that banning books was censorship and whether it was justified. Overwhelmingly, in every single round, the judges voted for the negative side. Because we set a precedent that even if there are, a few books that might be banned, a few examples, just a few bad apples, they rot the whole, right? And so when you allow censorship and when you allow people's free speech to be silenced, And we respond to those examples as, well, that's just one person, right? That's one person who didn't get into her dream school. That's one person who took their own life because of comments online that said that they would never be welcomed back into their community. That is the functional effect that ostracism has. And it is essential that we reckon with that. As I said earlier, right, there might be a few more severe examples on either side, but we have a moral obligation to analyze when people's free speech is censored. If I'm on campus and everybody has free speech, but for some reason my political beliefs are a little bit different, my free speech is not any less valuable because, well, most people weren't silenced, most people weren't censored, right? We have an obligation to protect every American's freedom of speech. And that is why Langston and I are focusing on these examples, because we do not believe that one person having access to their free speech stripped away from them by an aggressive culture online is any less legitimate of a threat than if it happened to 100,000 people. Because if it can happen to one, it can happen to 10, and it can happen to 100,000, and we are seeking to prevent that.
I'm sympathetic with your analysis, and I strongly do agree that in cases where cancel culture is unjustified, we should be critical of cancel culture. And we should say, hey, this was not justified. You shouldn't try to enforce all these different measures on these persons. But to say that their freedom of speech is gone, I think is it's definitely a bit of a jump, right? So let's take the example you stated. A person was denied entry into their university. They can still speak freely however they want. If it's a public campus, they can probably still go to that university and express their political opinion, obviously with some restrictions. But again, to argue that by the virtue of that person being canceled, that they can no longer express their free speech, I think is definitely a jump. And you have to really the affirmation has to deal with the real theoretical issue here, which is, why is free speech or cancel culture different from any other mass disapproval, right? Why is it different from a boycott? Why is it different from a mass protest? Sure, protests often have harmful consequences. We don't approve of all protests, but to say that those protests are a legitimate threat to free speech, the affirmation really has to show why those things either aren't equivalent or why they are a threat to free speech.
So let me jump in for a moment and ask the negative to address a comment that Langston made in his opening remarks. He indicated that one problem of cancel culture is that it alters the past. It actually results in individuals acting as though that event never happened. Negative team address that assertion.
Right. So we can, once again, this gets back to a fundamental disagreement we have over this resolution. I disagree with certain movements which attempt to cancel specific figures, and by doing so, attempt to rewrite the past. But the past is still there. You still have evidence of the past happening. To say that the past is being erased, I think is flawed, because, history hasn't changed. There is still, mass understanding that slavery happened, for instance. Even if people call for specific removal of, say, depictions of slavery, I don't think cancel culture will remove the awareness that slavery happened. And once again, cancel culture does not use a massively authoritative means like the government to implement its desires, right? So to say that cancel culture is a legitimate threat to free speech, you have to show how it acts like a government regulation, which would similarly threaten free speech. I think that idea, let me finish. One last thing. I think that ideas about the past can be expressed and they might be wrong objectively, but that does not make those ideas any less valuable as free speech. That does not mean that those ideas somehow silence history.
So I actually just have sort of a thought experiment in response to this. Langston is kind of really smart. I don't fully understand it, but I know that he does a lot of engineering things. If Langston was able to, perfect, then they can take this thought experiment. But if Langston or Akash were able to hack into Yatli and mute the speakers on one side, and the judges were asked to evaluate the round accordingly, one side got to speak and the other side was muted, do you think that this would be considered a threat to do you consider that this would be a threat to free speech?
It would be a threat to the free speech of the side muted. I'd also like to say, in your thought experiment, you're saying the site was hacked, which is illegal. I'm sure that hacking, again, let's not use thought experiments which throw us off the debate into other debates. Like we can debate if the debate was, is hacking good? Should hacking be allowed? Sure, then that thought experiment would be much more valuable than I think it is now for this debate.
And I just want to get that
Go ahead.
mention here. So once again, yeah, like we mentioned, this is a legal, or it's a like activity which is being taken, which generally violates standards of law, right? Hacking, we would agree, it's illegal. And the way it constitutes a legitimate threat to free speech is that it acts outside the law. It does illegal things. The government has a responsibility to ensure that illegal actions don't unnecessarily threaten free speech. But cancel culture does not function like that.
I would like to talk about freedom of speech. The negative keeps talking about freedom of speech as if it is only a legal doctrine. I think I speak for all of us when I say that I think freedom of speech is much more than a legal doctrine. I think it is something that we very much value in the society, and it is one of the tenets upon which our society is raised. I don't think it is just about the legal idea of free speech. I think this has to do with whether you feel safe speaking your mind and talking about difficult conversations from your perspective. I think just to say that, to talk about this argument in the context of the First Amendment, in the context of Supreme Court cases, I think narrows what this discussion could be.
So let me ask this question to the affirmative team. The negative team during their opening remarks indicated that cancel culture is actually a form of speech, actually a form of free speech. Can you address that?
Yeah, so, and I don't know if Langston wants to add on to this, but I'll say quickly, regardless of whether something is a form of speech, that doesn't mean that it's automatically, harmless, right? They themselves mentioned Brandenburg v. Ohio, a court case in which we decided that speech that calls for violence is inappropriate. Right? The nuance of defending our Constitution is that everybody has access to freedom of speech, but when there's contradictions between one person's freedom of speech and another, we have to have those debates more finely. We can't just say everyone gets free speech, and if it's not threatened by the government, then it's fine, because that doesn't interact with the nuance of the situation. So just as inciting speech is seen as something that is violent and can be punished, we believe that cancel culture, even if it is a form of speech, is still something that is violent and threatens freedom of speech.
I would strongly push back.
I think Langston was going to say something.
It's okay.
Yeah.
Let's turn to the negative team, and then we'll come back over to the affirmative.
I think that's definitely oversimplifying the issue. Like, you can look at specific instances where people have perhaps used calls for violence in a cancel post, for instance. But to say that cancel culture is by its nature violent, or that all cancellation is violent, I think is drastically undervaluing what violence actually does to free speech, right? Violence is clearly defined. The law understands, and I agree that we should be treating free speech as a principle in addition to a legal doctrine, but the way that we evaluate that principle is through the law, right? I'm not saying that the law must always be supreme, but the way we interpret and understand free speech and how we defend it in our society, that's done through legal proceedings. But to say that so once again, we drastically oppose that the equivalencies that the affirmation is making, that cancel culture, by virtue of it being perhaps like a large amount of people doing it, or it having consequences, is equivalent to a violent suppression of free speech. Once again, the affirmation hasn't actually shown you why cancel culture is by its nature any different than a protest or a boycott.
I would like to say that I believe that we have demonstrated that there are functional differences between cancel culture and a boycott. For instance, boycotts usually happen against people who are in power, and it does empower people in general to have some sort of a role in deciding important events, right? Important, for instance.
But what I'm talking about, the way it's the way,
right.
No matter who it's targeted at, what makes it functionally different?
Because, as we outlined in our definition, cancel culture focuses on outcomes. In order for cancel culture to be successful, its name must be proven accurate. Someone must be canceled. So, as we articulate, if I personally choose to boycott a company, I'm going to say, okay, I'm not supporting this energy drink company, and that's that. I'm not buying from them. They can do their own thing. I'm exiting the situation. Cancel culture is not that individual because it's a culture, right? And the aim is to cancel something, not to end my support, but to cancel that thing. So if I were to try to cancel this energy drink company, I would use the entire culture, the entire mob of people to penalize that company until they can no longer speak for themselves, to flood their social media inboxes, to send emails to the people that manage this company, to contact my representatives. People have done this in response because cancel culture, regardless of the stimulus, is about ending something, canceling something. And that is the difference. Boycotts seek to make change. Cancel culture seeks to bring things to an end.
So if I can respond to that. So I'm not going to use the example for the drink. And so this actually happens, this kind of protest where people email a company, they talk to their senators or whoever's in charge. So let's say there's a company that engages in animal testing. And people think, I think generally we all like to believe that animal testing is bad and they want the company to be canceled. And so this one person who's like an animal activist, spreads a petition. There's like thousands of people signing that petition against that company that they should stop using animal testing. The company is being cancelled. So are you proposing that kind of cancellation where 1,000 people are writing petitions, they are exercising their right to free speech, they are exercising their right to voice disapproval is wrong? Are you saying that they should be penalized just because they are getting together against something and standing up for that?
Yeah, our definition here is like cancel culture is like any form of communication in the sense that there are more severe examples and there are less severe examples. If I decide to protest something by posting one tweet online that says, I don't like this company, that's very different than if I go up to their store and start throwing rocks at the window. But those are still encompassed as protest. Cancel culture is the same way, right? Because you have examples of people who say, okay, so-and-so is over. Ben Shapiro is over, and it doesn't work. But that doesn't negate the fact that when cancel culture is successful, people are terminated. People do lose their careers. People do lose their education, and people do even lose their lives. That is when cancel culture is effective. And we shouldn't be evaluating it as not being a threat because in some instances it isn't, because it obviously, when successful, is a threat to free speech and communication.
If I can point
I would also like to...
Oh.
Let's go to the negative team, and then we'll go ahead from the negative side.
One example, throwing rocks at the window. I don't think that's cancellation. That's destruction of property. And if someone is throwing rocks at the window of a shop or anything, I think you would call 911. So I don't think you should say that's cancellation. Okay. I apologize for misunderstanding something you might have said then.
No, it's okay. That's my bad. If I miscommunicated, I would like to clarify. We aren't saying that throwing rocks at a building is cancel culture, and I appreciate you making that distinction. We were saying that in the context of boycotting, there is a range from saying I won't buy this to I'm going to go throw rocks at this window. That's boycotting, not cancel culture. I apologize for the confusion there.
I have a question, like going off of the boycott example. Even if, like, say there's a racist company and you want the company to be ended because it is racist, because you feel like it's a harm against the idea of having an equal egalitarian society. Even if a protest, like, and a social movement, its goal is to end that company, like, even if their stated goal is to no longer have that company in business, how does that speech hurt? Like, how does that speech being there and that them like making that speech, how does that constitute a legitimate threat against that company's free speech?
I think one of the things that we're talking about here is the difference, right, between boycott and cancel culture. And I think in that instance, you can boycott the company. And what boycotts do is that they pressure the company to change their image slightly, right, or to have this sort of change. When you cancel something, you're saying this company doesn't have a chance with me anymore. I have no desire to engage in conversations or sort of even accept a heartfelt apology and a promise to do things right. I think that this is one of the fundamental differences between cancel culture and boycotts.
I don't think people have any obligations to accept their conversation. They can reject conversing with someone if they wish to. So I don't see how that helps your case.
So if I wanted to come to Regents Cup right? And Langston went in my past and found that there was a time that I said China virus instead of coronavirus because I was uneducated. And he decided to cancel me, right? He went on our team's social media and he decided to say, Abigail is over. Abigail has committed something that is unreasonable, right? And I was not able to attend the Regents Cup as a result of that. Is that not a violation of my free speech just because it doesn't come from the government? Because in that instance, I am losing the ability to speak and advocate for myself because somebody tried to cancel me.
Well, I would say that the Regents Cup maintains the right to not allow people if they don't want to promote certain views. Once again, you are still free to express your views in any other ways. You are free to go and protest. You are free to go and organize. You are free to go and assemble. Just because a specific organization has decided not to engage in certain activity with you or not to give you a platform, that does not mean that you're free speech. And again, free speech has a very grounded legal definition. I think I still don't want to jump away from the fact that legal precedent has clearly defined what is and isn't a legitimate threat to free speech. And an organization deciding that it doesn't want your speech to be represented, it deciding that they don't want your speech on their platform, for instance. We had a whole debate about this. That is not a legitimate threat to free speech. And we can look to, that's the thing. We can look to legitimate threats of free speech, right? We gave you a whole second contention about what is a legitimate threat to free speech. It's a government activity. It's companies coming together for perhaps in monopolistic ways and ensuring that people can't speak out for fear of violence, for instance, or for fear of threat. In all of these cases, speech is not the mechanism by which other speech is restricted. That's just not how it goes. So yeah, again, once again, the affirmation has to prove definitively why its role as speech is different. And I don't think they failed to have done that.
So from the negative side, can you address, there's been some dialogue from the affirmative side that we're not talking about individuals' free speech, but rather we're talking about when it actually becomes mob rule, mob behavior, mob conduct. And so can you discuss when it crosses that line into that mob mentality, that's when it becomes cancel culture, and that's what truly threatens free speech?
So I think that you would feel like free speech is actually threatened when action is taken against you that could harm your safety or security or could harm your ability to engage in normal everyday things. But we don't think that because an individual social media company, for instance, decided to ban you or other people decided not to speak to you, that constitutes a legitimate threat to free speech. Once again, people are free to hold their opinions and free to express their opinions. And we don't think that just because a large amount of people have done that, that you suddenly can no longer express your opinions. That's just not true. And we think it's dangerous to assume so because it limits the, it's dangerous to say that cancel culture is free speech because there are all these instances of people using quote unquote cancel culture as a means to actively promote change, good change that we support.
So we're nearing an end, so I'm going to turn, I know you want to add on, but I'm going to turn to the affirmative side just to make sure that as we near the end that both sides have an opportunity to respond.
Langston, please go ahead.
Oh, well, part of, I think, what you talked about, right, at the end of your speech is these are changes that we want to support. The question then becomes who's we? Because if it's just like, if just the world evolved around the people who decided to cancel whatever they want, I'm not sure that is conducive to a society where diverse opinions or discourse is highly valued. There was a point in our constructive that I don't think really came up during our discussion, which is the potential for this to cause other people to self-censor and they do feel pressured not to talk about what they want to talk about, right? For instance, there is a person at ASU who is not a tenured person who sometimes fears to speak out about what they believe in because they fear that they might get canceled or they might do something that, and since they don't have tenure, they So this type of self-censorship is very, very pervasive, and I'm good to see that actually in today's world.
So let me give the negative, the final word there to address what Langston just said about that self-censorship that may occur in connection with cancel culture. So the final word from the negative side.
Well, I think that, first of all, nobody is, when a large amount of people express disapproval of your viewpoint, nobody is coercing you, nobody is forcing you to make a specific change to your conduct. I mean, it may seem perhaps superfluous, but we live in a society and people can engage in social pressure and push people towards specific directions. We don't think that calling that a legitimate threat to free speech is really productive, because at the end of the day, cancel culture has been with us as a form of public disapproval of something for centuries. And I don't think that it truly constitutes a threat to free speech, because at the end of the day, many people who are still quote unquote canceled continue to operate, continue to remain in power. And especially a large target of cancel culture is large companies or institutions, for instance. If cancel culture truly did have such a overwhelming influence on our society, then you would see companies losing out on tons of profit. You would see companies closing down. You would see people who are already in power losing some of that power. And insofar as cancel culture hasn't done that, we can draw a direct equivalence between cancel culture and any other form of speech.
So thank you very much for this extraordinary dialogue back and forth during the cross-examination phase of this debate. We're going to now move into the third phase, which is our closing statement. So first, we're going to hear from the affirmative team. You have 5 minutes. I will give you the 1 minute mark. It's not an hour, it's only 5 minutes, and you can begin whenever you're ready.
Today's resolution calls us to evaluate. Cancel culture is a legitimate threat to free speech. And if you want the answer, you can Google it, right? But the reason that we're here today is because the Regents have set a precedent, which is that our individual voices matter. We have had 2 prelims and a series of elimination rounds in which we celebrate individuality and individual expression and our ability to express ourselves. If free speech was limited to speech as a whole or what constitutes the majority, you could go read an article from Fox, CNN, MSNBC, or any other organization telling you their views on free speech. But you as judges believe that we matter. Myself, Langston, Joshua, and Akash, all of our voices matter. So the insinuation that just because it is only a few voices being threatened, that cancel culture is not a legitimate threat to free speech, is absolutely a disgrace to the nature of what our Constitution was written for and what free speech should, not just legally, but morally apply to. Let's go down some of the arguments made in today's debate. Recognize, again, the resolution asks us to evaluate whether cancel culture is a legitimate threat to free speech, not whether cancel culture is always a legitimate threat to free speech. This resolution does not call us to prove that every person who tries to start a Twitter mob or a hashtag is threatening free speech, but simply that this form of protest has the potential to silence people into oblivion. We have proven that this happens, A, through a multitude of individual examples, but B, through 3 clear ways that we articulate in our constructive. First, as Langston so eloquently mentions at the end of our cross-examination period, self-censorship. This is arguably the worst form of censorship, because we will never know who has been silenced if they don't get to speak in the first place. Self-censorship occurs because people fear social rejection more than they fear losing their belief system. They try to make a claim at the end of cross-examination that coercion is just a part of our lives, but that is absolutely not true. Now, we have the ability to try to change people's minds and use public discourse. That's what we're doing here today. But we do not have the right to coerce people to the point where they would rather take their own life than go on Twitter and clarify what they meant. That is the effect of cancel culture. It does not ask people if they would like to continue having a conversation. It promptly ends it. But further, let's talk about 2 other ways in which censorship is explicitly enabled through cancel culture. This is on our second contention about cultural erasure. Initially, cancel culture is already rewriting our history by taking away books like the Dr. Seuss books that promote discrete forms of racism, or by taking away movies like Gone with the Wind that showcase a time in which slavery was an issue in our United States. Cancel culture is threatening to rewrite history, to censor the parts that are uncomfortable and lead us to believe that our history was spotless. It wasn't. It is important that we continue to have these discussions, and even if not every attempt at cancel culture silences them, the fact that one cancel culture silenced Gone with the Wind, and one cancel culture caused Dr. Seuss to pull books out of circulation proves that there is a legitimate threat to free speech, and it is absolutely something to consider. But finally, there's a cultural implication. Something that does not get talked about in cross-examination that we should absolutely be discussing is how a professor lost his career due to him educating students to use a word that means that in Chinese that sounded similar to the N-word. Cancel culture is not a form of protest. It does not involve telling people why they were harmful and how they can correct it. It again, and I cannot stress this enough, emphasizes ending the conversation. That professor never got an opportunity to apologize, to clarify, to explain what his discourse meant because he was canceled, and that was it. The student who used the N-word 4 years ago, which she later explained was a result of her ignorance, was canceled from attending her dream university. There are countless examples like the one Langston tells you of somebody who took their own life. And if you think that this isn't affecting everyone, which means that it is not a threat to free speech, then clearly we do not understand what free speech is. My right as an individual is protected. And if we are silencing that because the majority is fine, then we are not protecting free speech. Unless we protect free speech for everyone, we protect it for none. Cancel culture is violent, silencing, and censors individuals. And even if it doesn't always succeed, the fact that it can is enough to justify why we are so proud and call you to affirm.
Thank you. And for our negative team, we also have 5 minutes. Just a moment.
Yeah.
You may begin when you're ready.
Absolutely. So before I get into my closing statement, I think it's essential for all of us to take a bird's eye view. We should for like maybe 5 seconds get out of the point scoring mentality. And I want us to focus what this debating tournament is about. It's about exchanging ideas. It's about there's different contentions. We have discussed banning books and banning people off social media, and it just seems like in all of them, free speech prevails. So with that thought, I'm gonna jump into my closing statement. So the first and foremost thing I'd like to say is that we recognize, we sympathize with the examples Abigail gave and Langston gave. There are individual instances when the effect of cancel culture might not have been ideal, when the judgment placed by the mob was not fair. But just because there's individual cases, just because cancel culture maybe is problematic, doesn't mean that the pillars of free speech are falling. Doesn't mean that free speech is being tarnished. Doesn't mean that cancel culture is a legitimate threat. Again, we could discuss if this debate was about is cancel culture problematic, then I would be happier debating with the AF. I would probably abandon Josh and I'd be like, no, I don't like your arguments or something. But that's not what the debate is about. The debate is about whether cancel culture is a legitimate threat. And then we show you with the different examples that it's not. So even we agree. The other thing we agree with, which the opposition brought up in the cross-examination, is that free speech is more than just a legal right. We totally get that. To answer to that objection, number one, we use legal definitions and legal cases to show that it has legal backing. That's how it's justified. But we agree with the principle. And if the idea of free speech is exchanging ideas, exchanging controversial ideas even, we would argue that cancel culture is helping free speech. And the way that it's doing that is by, let's take the example of Ben Shapiro, as Josh was saying in his opening, that he has way more subscribers now. He has way more people listening to him, reading his books, because he's a controversial speaker because he has this megaphone now. He has a larger audience. So in a way, at least in that instance, cancel culture is helping promote free speech. There's a few things which the affirmation didn't address one bit. One of them was how cancel culture is different from any other form of protest. You do say that, you know, if 1,000 people you know, write petitions or write letters and get a company banned, that's a violent kind of protest, and that's a negative impact of cancel culture. That is a dubious claim. That is a serious. You are implying that people should not be able to do so. You also offer no solutions. So, which was something which was never brought up in the cross-ex again, but I think it's also important to discuss the solution. So let us even assume that those 1,000 people canceling a company is wrong, then how do we solve that problem? I think solutions should have been discussed. The other point which the affirmation made was about self-censorship. This was made both in the opening statement and also mentioned again by Abigail. And I actually sympathize with that a bit. Self-censorship can be a problem. So like if there's a family dinner, I think we would all benefit from not saying certain things. But that doesn't mean that it's a legitimate threat to free speech. We act differently in social circumstances. We conform to some standards, but that's different from something that's a legitimate threat to free speech. And the last thing I would like to say is how cancel culture erases foreign culture. This lone example of this professor who was fired for saying a word which sounded like a racial slur, but was teaching a Chinese class. Was Chinese culture cancelled, or did Chinese culture evaporate? I don't think so. So I think what I'm trying to say is we should not use these lone examples and take them to the extreme to think that cancel culture is a legitimate threat to free speech. And the last thing that I'll say is that if this tournament has shown us anything, it's that free speech cannot and will not be cancelled. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So a great round of applause. The one problem with our platform experience instead of in person is you would now be deafened with applause and yelling and screaming, and everyone would be cheering your names. I'm not really sure that that's true, but assume that it is. I know that I speak on behalf of all of the judges when I share my thoughts that you did an absolutely extraordinary job. The results will post shortly. You will be able to find these on the Regents Cup webpage, which is regentscup2021.azregents.edu. Again, that is regentscup2021.azregents.edu. I've had the privilege of being able to participate in this competition all day. I can tell you that I have just been extraordinarily impressed with everyone's passion and your professionalism, and I am reassured that our future is in very safe hands with individuals that we like the individuals that we saw today. So on behalf of all of the members who participated in the Regent Cup, congratulations, best of luck, and thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you so much. Joshua and Akash, it's been a pleasure. I feel like we went from 100 to 1,000 with this debate.
Definitely.
From our last one, and
The whole
it's just
tournament.
great. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Too.
Congratulations to all of you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
All right.